Hi, I'm Hector Moran, and this is a quick walkthrough of mFusion and some of its features. So what you're seeing on screen right now is a game asset that I created for purposes of showing what mFusion is capable of doing and how it can streamline your workflow for texturing. Now I've switched to the PSD here for that specific asset. And for example, the usual way that you would be previewing and working with your textures is, of course, you would be changing the layers that need to be saved, and then you would save them as a TGA with the right naming convention, and then you would come in here to Maya to just reload that texture and see the changes. So for example, if I turned off the numbers over here and I just resaved the texture and I wanted to see what that looks like, I save that texture, which can be a bit of a slow process at times, and then of course over here hit reload, and yeah, it shows you the latest version. So that's basically the standard workflow for a lot of things with working with Maya. And now I'm going to open up mFusion and start showing you some of its features. So navigation is pretty standard in mFusion. Navigation consists of basically holding Alt and using left click to rotate or tumble your camera. You use Alt and right click to zoom in and out, and you use Alt and middle click to pan your camera. So this is the default how mFusion opens up, and this is just a sphere to preview the environment. And let's just get started by importing a model. So I'm going to import the model that you saw just now in Maya. Here you have it without textures, and this is where mFusion starts shining. So here I will import the texture of that asset, and basically I'm seeing what the asset would look like with all of its layers active, all of its layers turned on, because what mFusion does is that, and you're seeing the layers over here, what mFusion does is that it brings all of your layers, folders of layers rather, as materials that you can use and preview here. So for example, I have the basic material that is underneath here, and everything is really shiny right now because mFusion basically works in a way that it looks up, for example, its naming conventions, which is diffuse and normal, and it will assign those textures as it sees them, and when it doesn't find the specular and the gloss map, it will basically assign white to that. So here I have, for example, the lever that allows me to control the specular and gloss contribution, and I'm seeing right here how the gloss is affecting this material. This is physically based lighting model, and of course mFusion includes both lighting models, the newer more next-gen lighting model, which is more physically based, and the older lighting model, which is basically what you might find in mobile phones, games, and older video games. So I'm going to go back to the physically based, because right now what I'm trying to show is some of the physically based properties that you can work with. And yeah, so here for example I can play around with the gloss contribution. You can see it very reflective, sharp highlights, and you can also just make the material a bit rougher. And then of course if you get a fully white, fully shiny specular contribution, you get the drone basically looking like chrome. And I already have a project file that is saved with the properties that I want. So I'm going to load that one because that will be faster for the purposes of this demo. So let's go and do that. So I'm going to load project, and I already have it right here. And so yeah, this is basically the starting state that I want to look at, for example, with this. And what you can see again is my folders. They're all here, but they're almost all of them switched off except for the ones that I want to see. So I'm gonna go from bottom to top, and you're gonna see, for example, here, this is the layer where the lights are. The lights have a lot more reflectivity and a pretty sharp specular. But yeah, you can see again, I didn't bother in my PSD. I didn't bother create a spec map. It doesn't even have a normal map, because when mFusion does not find those maps, it basically ignores them, or in the case of the specular and the gloss contribution, you can just regulate it. That way you don't have to be messing with shades of gray that you need to find to get the right amount of shininess and reflectivity on your material. So that's the lights material, and this is the raw plating material. So this is the shiny metal plates that you see on this drone. And this one, for example, this is the only layer in this case in the PSD where I actually bothered to create a spec map, right? And you see the spec map right here. It's fairly light. It has a bit of contrast. And another thing that I wanted to go into about mFusion is that it works with smart objects. So even though it expects that that you have a layer called diffuse, it doesn't have to be a flat layer. It can also be a smart object, smart Photoshop object, in which you have a folder with a lot of layers. So you can work on your diffuse map as you would with a lot of layers and a lot of utilities in there. You can work with that PSD separately, and then you can just decide, for example, I want more occlusion or I want less occlusion on this base layer. So let's say I want a contribution of 25 on that specular map. I save that, I close it, and it's updated back here in my, so you see, for example, I go back and undo, so it goes a little more specular, I mean a little more occlusion, and then less occlusion on that base layer. And then I just update that PSD, and it doesn't matter what layers I have active and visible in my PSD. mFusion basically will take that update, and it will only update in the project file the layers that you changed. So let's see that a bit more dramatically. So for example, let's say I go into the smart object and just so you can see it a bit more clearly. Let's say I start just really changing the color of this base layer with whatever adjustments like this. I can save those changes in the smart object, switch back to my main PSD, those changes are updated. I can save my PSD, and mFusion is already working and hot reloading that PSD. And here you see it, it's updated. Now the base layer is red, or it has some splotches of red color on it. One of the shortcuts that you find on mFusion, which is pretty useful for when you have a one monitor setup, let's say you don't have a lot of screens to work with, you can always use the shortcut T, and T will basically make mFusion stay always on top. and that means that you can, for example, just go back over here to your PSD. I still have the Smart Object PSD open. I'm going to undo that thing. I'm gonna save that PSD, and it updates back in the original PSD. And now in mFusion it basically reloaded really quick, and now it's back to the normal blue that it had. So for example, let's say you need to test different looks on this kind of asset, and let's say you have, for example, one version that has to be kind of metallic, slightly chrome, and then you are also asked to do versions that are maybe painted, that have different base materials on them. You can basically use the folders and Photoshop to change those looks. And here I have a layer where I've basically made an orange paint job on those platings, and it's not much of a dramatic change as far as the specularity and other properties. I mean, it's more like painted metal. And another layer that I have right here is, for example, just some white striping on the drone. And what I wanted to show you here also is that if you open up the properties of that subfolder material, you can mess around. For example, you can have offsets, you can scale the UVs up and down. This is more useful for environment textures, of course, but here you can regulate how shiny that white paint is. Also the gloss contribution that happens to it, and you can decide on the layer blend mode that you have. So for example, there's hard, there's soft, and there's linear mode. And another nice feature that you will find here is that the normal map, basically those stripes of paint, can be raised up so that the paint layer gets a bit more height, and you can see that raised up a little bit here. You can also use overlay and detail modes. This is more for when you have a different structure. So for example, let's say that white paint had a grainy normal map. You would basically be able to overlay that normal map on top of that. You can also bump inwards those materials, and this will be better shown also with the next folder. So the next folder in Photoshop, which is the next material here in mFusion, is the scratched metal. Actually, I'm skipping that one just now, but basically this is like scratches on the paint where the paint has kind of chipped off, things like that. It's a bit wear and tear. I could basically make all of this layer into a layer full of scratches, and for example, the way I work with that layer is that I can go back here into the layers, and I have a flat kind of metallic texture underneath, under the fuse. And just so that I can preview that, the way mFusion looks at the layers and switches the materials is based on a vector mask over here. So for example, let's say I start kind of making a lot of scratching. Let's find a better brush for that. Yeah, so so the paint is really wearing out, and you could do this with rust and many other effects, but basically you could have a lot of different paint scratches, and going back to Photoshop, hitting Control S to save, and immediately the new paint scratches show up here. And yeah, let's say I didn't like that, so I'm gonna go back and undo all of that. I hit again save in Photoshop, and you see that the scratches are back. The paint is back on the place now. So yeah, this is how quick you can update some of your layers and basically have a very flexible layered approach to your texturing. The last layer that I have here is just one layer that is called Decals, and this is again just more kind of labeling and numbering and things like that on the drone. I can have them on, I can have them off. I can have also more or less specular contribution. And in the folder you see, for example, my specular contribution for the decals layer is just a black layer called specular, because I didn't want these to be too shiny or shiny at all. So I could basically regulate my specular contribution. So in the case of contributions where you want the specular to be black, so you want no specular, you can always use a black layer and then over here regulate. So let's say we're happy with the look of this. Let's say we have all the speculars where we want them, and the bump mapping is deep enough. We could customize it a little bit more. So for example, the bump scale on the scratches could be a bit deeper. You can see it here. Let's enlarge it. So yeah, you can decide how much to bump that up or down. And one of the main features of Fusion is that basically once you've worked with the different materials and you have them blended in the way that you want to have them, now you can have a preview. And the shortcut for previewing your baked texture is P. So for example, here we see a very low res preview. This is originally a 2K by 2K texture, so of course it's gonna lose a lot of definition if we bake it at 512 by 512. If we preview it at 1K, it's a little bit better, but in this case we might as well bake it at 2K. And I think my computer is a bit slow from the capturing. But basically, once we are happy with our combination of materials, we can just hit the letter B or hit this button right here, and that will basically bake the textures. You just saw the little loading bar for mFusion really fast baking those textures, and we can see those textures right here. So once mFusion has done its baking, now we have a specular map that combines all of the, well actually this is the gloss map and this is the specular map. So here you see, for example, the orange specular map. This is just a dark gray on the base material, and we have the specular map of the white paint, and then for the fusion letters and all of those decals. So all of the materials have been merged. So for example, if I had a detailed normal map, you would see the roughness of something like that. But basically here in the combined normal map, you're seeing the scratches being chipped away, and you're seeing here the Fusion letters being raised up. So this is what the combined normal map looks like. Again, the gloss map and the combined diffuse map with all of the decals and everything right there. So this is a big time saver for when you need to make multiple versions of the asset. You need to have different spec maps on it. You need to have all these different shaders and different looks on them. And if we wanted to have a set of new textures baked, we could just go back over here to the materials, turn off the scratch metal for example, and maybe leave the decals on, turn off the orange and the white paint, and let's say we want that underneath material to be a bit brighter in the specular, so we give it a bit more specular contribution, a little bit more gloss, and then we can hit P to see the preview of the bake. There's almost no change because we're baking at the same size. So if we just hit B, again you see the bar and the textures have been quickly overwritten, and now of course this the images are updated. So now we have what the diffuse map would look like with that combination of materials. This is what the gloss map would look like with that combination of materials, and this is what the diffuse map, I mean the spec map, would look like with that combination of materials. So I think I will close this demo here for now. If you have questions, you can contact us, and the details should be in the comment bar for this video. Otherwise, I'm sure other contacts will be provided for. So thanks for checking out this video, and I hope you will check out mFusion too. Bye.